Welcome, everybody. Michael, should we go ahead and start?
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And special thank you for Michael, the CIO of the City of Aurora, one of our most valued clients. We've been working together for almost 3 years, I think now. And we're excited to host Michael and hear more about some of the challenges that CIOs are experiencing now, CIOs of cities are experiencing now during this crazy COVID time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Michael, do you want to also introduce yourself shortly before I hand it off to you?
Right, thanks. So Mike Pegues, CIO for the City of Aurora, been there since June of 2017. Aurora is the second largest city in the state of Illinois. All right, and thanks everybody for attending.
Awesome. So just a bit about our agenda today. So first of all, we're going to turn it to Michael and hear more about how COVID met the City of Aurora and how Michael and the rest of the city and team are dealing with it at the moment. And then narrowing down to specific issues that chief information officers, IT directors, innovation teams are experiencing right now, and how do they prioritize different resources. And then we'll go to some best practices and finish with questions, an open session of Q&A. So please feel free to post your questions during the presentation. I'll make sure to get to it at the end. Yes, so turning it off to you, Michael.
Okay, so I actually introduced myself already. I think we can kind of go ahead and skip to the next slide, Noah. All right, so actually before we jump into this slide, what I kind of just like to kind of set the stage here for the City of Aurora and for many of you as well within your respective areas. So Governor J.B. Pritzker, Governor of Illinois, declared that all counties in the state of Illinois as a disaster area on March 9th, right? Due to the outbreak of the COVID disease and the pandemic. As we know, and as many of us has actually experienced, that's had significant economic impact, including loss of income and wages, and it's threatened to undermine different basic securities that we took for granted previously in terms of housing, security, public health, safety, and so forth. And that's been at a state level. But here within the City of Aurora, Mayor Richard C. Irvin basically enacted a city ordinance which confirmed that state of emergency within the city boundaries due to the pandemic. Now that was officially posted or enacted on, excuse me if I get the date wrong, but I think it's March 16th, right? And once that was actually enacted, we actually activated our virtual Emergency Operations Center on March 20th. With that, we basically started a series of incident action planning across the City of Aurora, which basically defined our mission objectives. It also defined different things along with operational periods and command emphasis, focusing on situational awareness within the city and reporting on personnel, resources, activities, so forth and so on. And also we enacted this virtual organizational structure that we're working out of now in order to basically to manage the activities that are facing us today. And with that being said, you know, we're facing different issues and concerns here within the City of Aurora and surrounding communities within the state, so forth and so on. But in terms of, you know, the stay at home, right? Social distancing requirements, right? Enactment of, you know, shutting down businesses and only letting those essential businesses actually stay open and work, right? So non-essential businesses and operations basically ceased in the City of Aurora, right? And there's also prohibited and permitted travel. Also, we can't leave, home unless it's for essential activities, which is actually permitted, right? And there's various protocols that have also commenced as well. That being said, this thing has really hit home, right? And as we can see that our mayor, Richard C. Irvin, and also our police chief Zeman were actually tested positive for COVID-19. Now, thank God, both of those individuals have actually recovered, right? And they're in full operational mode. They're still running the city. Chief Zeman still managing the public safety aspect of the City of Aurora. And actually one of our other patrol commanders within the city and various other employees have been impacted by COVID. So, this has really hit home, right? So just to kind of give the people on the line kind of a feel in terms of the impact here, the state of Illinois, the official numbers as of April 6th, there's basically about 12,262 cases. There's about 307 deaths, right? And that's statewide, right? And that's broken down by counties as well. The City of Aurora itself, we've had 96 cases and about 4 deaths that's actually been reported. Keeping in mind that the City of Aurora sits in 4 different counties. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage in terms of, this is really hitting home, and it's basically changing the way that we operate and we work on a day-to-day basis. So
yeah, and Mike, and I'm really glad to hear that both of Mayor Irvin and Chief Zeman are feeling better, but we really see it from a lot of our partners and a lot of the cities that we work with, that the mayors and the city officials sometimes are in the front line, right? And they're putting themselves in a great risk because they're actually the people on the ground. And we admire the work, and we're really glad to hear that both of them are back to good health.
Right. And those are some of the attributes of great leaders, right? So, so this next slide, we're going to focus on in terms of how the City of Aurora has basically managed this COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to actually getting into Q&A and also the interactive piece, because I want to also hear from different municipalities and agencies in terms of what they're doing as well, right? So just let's kind of hit some of the key themes there, right? So without reading down the list, right, this whole, stay at home has impacted us in terms of, enabling a remote workforce, right? Now, us as IT professionals, this is nothing new to us, but in a government setting, right, traditional business has been, performed more face-to-face, right? With city council meetings and board and commission meetings, it's always that face-to-face interaction, right? So now, as we start to, we're basically forced to work remote, due to the state of emergencies that's been enacted. It's basically, forcing us into this mode that we're not really comfortable with as a whole, as a city, in terms of the way we're doing work, right? So we need new systems and softwares that allow us to use these different devices effectively, from all different spectrums, whether it's CRM software, it's call directories, whether it's collaboration tools. These cloud-based solutions provide us the means and the capabilities to use that technology ecosystem that typically is available in our office and allows us and empowers us to actually work from home, right? And the biggest example of that has basically been Zoom, right? I think I was just talking with my leadership staff and my director of operations and our deputy CIO, and we were looking at the Zoom stock. It's like, man, we should have gotten on top of that before this ever happened, right? It's just skyrocketed, right? So Zoom being one, right? And then other aspects of, you're trying to run city council meetings, right, in a virtual environment, but we also need to think about the back end operations, and that's where the CIOs and the IT professionals come in. How do we do that? How do we get signatures if the mayor, the councilman, the aldermen, and the city officials are all scattered remotely, and we have these social distancing practices, right? And City Hall has been closed down, right? So now we need to start looking at different tools like DocuSign, right? So we can use those tools to keep those day-to-day operations going, right? And then there's other things around like digitalization of online forms and services, which many of us have. But now we're taking a very microscopic view in terms of what are the gaps and how do we keep these things running, right? We also looking at different things around Citrix and VDI environments and Office 365, right? There's actually an old adage in the public sector where we always say, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So use this opportunity, making sure that you document those lessons learned, right? And you can basically take that back and prepare, as we move forward, right? So, and that, as we've also looked in terms of like the supply chains impacts, I mean, this has been probably one of the biggest impacts, I think, in the city of Aurora, right? Where we have a total of about 1,200 city employees, right? And now, actually, I would say over 96-7% of the people are working remote, right? Now, in terms of the infrastructure and laptops and VPNs, I mean, we weren't prepared for that. I mean, in the city of Aurora, I think we had a total of maybe 15, if that, maybe 10 to 15 laptops available, right? Up until about, 2 or 3 weeks ago, right? So if you think about that at scale across the United States, when all these municipalities start reaching out to the OEMs and saying, hey, I need, 300 laptops, 400 laptops, then you start thinking about at the state level where they need thousands of laptops. You can imagine the strain on the supply chain and the impacts that that's having, right? It also makes us look at, in terms of our economy, in terms of where a lot of this equipment are actually being manufactured, because a lot of them are being manufactured outside of the continental of the United States, right? So, there's some economic impacts that I think as a nation that we need to look at as well, right? And who gets priority on these different resources? I can tell you right now, in terms of the municipalities, we don't, right? Actually, the federal government and DOD gets first priority on any resources. So, our Governor Pritzker often mentions in his news release the fact that he's basically pleading to President Trump to enact this the Defense Procurement Act, which would basically help us increase the productivity of essential resources to help us to continue to do our jobs, to manage this epidemic, to basically kind of curve this negative impact on everything that's going on, right? So, I mean, there's so many different angles to this thing, and it's hitting us all, from 360 different ways. And I think these sessions are very vital for us to try to understand and share ideas and different alternative solutions.
Michael, something that we talked about before is the council meeting that you guys did through Zoom, or how did you broadcast that? Because you said it was pretty interesting that so many more people actually showed up. Can you elaborate about that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So April 1st at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, the City of Aurora initiated its first ever Zoom City Council meeting, which was actually live streamed on Facebook. And I can't say that it was a success, although I would say certain people within the mayor's office was kind of freaking out because it had never been done. I was like, okay, well, we do these meetings all the time, maybe not just in the city council format, but I mean, it's a standard operation, right? So that was successful. Now, on average, when we have the traditional city council meetings, we have an average number of views for our regular city council meeting, which is around 2,400 on Facebook, right? But during this Zoom city council meeting that was streamed live on Facebook, we had a total number of views around about 9,500 total views, right? So we experienced the uptick in participation rates that we hadn't previously had. I mean, if you think about that, that's significant. That's 4 times the amount of people that are engaging virtually to see what's going on, to understand, the different city business, public comments, and the different agendas.
And Michael, you said that it wasn't even a controversial kind of, it wasn't, about legalization of cannabis or anything that you would expect to bring 7 or 8 times more people than a regular meeting.
Right. So, I mean, most of the business was what we call on consent agenda. So there was, like you said, it wasn't very controversial, right? And we still have those type of numbers. Now, think if it's something controversial like legalization of cannabis, right?
Which was actually a question in the city of Aurora and a lot of other cities in Illinois a few months ago.
Exactly. Excuse me. But you can imagine if there's something on there that's controversial. I mean, we potentially expect to see those numbers even double once again. And that's the first one. I'd just like to kind of just interject there. Do we have Clay Muhammad on the call from the City of Aurora? No. All right. So
Michael, I have a first question for you regarding these these meetings. So okay. a city in Pennsylvania is actually asking how you're permitted to have virtual meetings normally, because in the state of Pennsylvania, they're still working on getting them approved. And right now they're still requiring physical meetings.
Right. I think based on the guidance that we received from our corporation counsel, that there were no restrictions in terms of having the virtual meetings. They just had to be recorded, right? And we need to be able to provide that recording for access. Jeff Anderson, are you on the line? Just Deputy CIO for City of Aurora. I wanted to see if he had some comments on that particular topic. Jeff, are you there? Maybe not. Okay. No. So there.
I see. He's actually here.
Yeah, I'm actually here.
Okay.
Yeah. So we worked hard in Aurora to ensure that it still operated like a public meeting. So the agenda went out with the Zoom credentials to log into the meeting. The prior to having this on Zoom, the instructions for the public were to contact the city clerk. Same thing happened. If they wanted to speak at the meeting, they'd contact the city clerk. So we did have members of the public who came in this way, dialed in via phone. We admitted them into the room. They spoke their piece in front of the city council, and they listened to the rest of the meeting. So we, even though it was virtual, we tried to make it act as though it was physical and from that respect. So, we got, a couple of talkers, I believe, that came to that meeting as well.
And I think this is interesting because it's a concept that we at Zencity obviously are always thinking about, whether people will we get more participation if we look at more digital kind of sources. As we understand, some people don't have the time to show up to council meetings. People don't have the opportunity to talk with their governments, but a lot of people have feedback that they want to share. So we at Zencity are not doing the counseling, they're actually pulling the data from more passive sources. But I think even the fact that in digital council meetings, 7 or 10 times more people showed up means that a lot of people want to participate. And again, we're talking about not a meeting where we're talking about legalization of cannabis. So you can imagine how many people would be interested in joining to something that controversial.
Absolutely, and those are very valid points, Noah. And actually, again, it's taking the situation that we're in and basically learning from it and trying to augment the things that, as us IT professionals, we know work and we know that are valuable. And we're just having the opportunity to basically to prove it out, right? So.
Yeah, and Michael, if you can comment just about that, so you're saying that basically a lot of CIOs and IT professionals been trying to push to a more digital transformation for years, and now in a way have the opportunity to do it because a lot of the more traditional forms of work and engagement and collaboration are kind of out of the question. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I can give a couple examples in the City of Aurora where there are certain departments that are very good at trying to move to more digital, to a more digital platform. And there's some departments that are they need a little nudge, right? So I can make an example here in the City of Aurora as our development services, which is basically code enforcement, building permits, property standards, also public works, right? So they have a lot of their forms that are online, so they're easily accessible. We've even started to do virtual inspections, right? Using Zoom, using Duo, and even using FaceTime for the inspectors that can go out when there's things that need to be remediated, right? So enacting those capabilities for the different departments basically show them that, hey, listen, this isn't as difficult as we thought, and they see gains in terms of productivity, right? So measuring those and being able to, to kind of basically to validate in terms of, operational performance and areas where, costs can be optimized. I mean, it's actually very valuable. Now, on the other hand, we have some areas that are very paper heavy, right? Like human resources, and the need for digitalized services there is blatantly obvious, right? So we've had conversations at the mayor's executive level in terms of, okay, this is a lesson learned. We already see that right now. Let's start engaging to see that, how we can start ramping up those potential services and trying to scope out different projects to digitalize certain services and digitalizing forms and providing online collaboration tools where, typically if I have my paycheck or I have a timesheet, right? And it's an area where we have on our portfolio in terms of improvement, like digital timesheets, right? And having that, being able to do that online versus having to sign a time and attendance sheet, right? That should be pushed up on the prioritization list, Go ahead,
and
Norm.
it could actually benefit the city also after we're finishing. With Corona, we'll have all the infrastructure to go digitally and be much more connected, also when we're not physically in the same place. Another question that we got, Michael, is if you can share, you've talked about the heat that small businesses are kind of experiencing now due to social distancing and the situation right now with COVID. Can you maybe share what some of the work that the City of Aurora is doing to try to help the small businesses, and whether anything that we talked about in digital transformation can be in any of assistance in here? You're muted, Michael.
Yeah, sorry about that. So, I mean, we can go down the list in terms of different areas where we're focused on in terms of, businesses, assisting for senior citizens, schools and education, supporting local restaurants by, as we all know, those dine-in options have been closed to the public, so we've enacted different capabilities there in terms of takeout, right, delivery, curbside service, and providing a list on our city website in terms of which restaurants actually have services, curbside services, that can be taken advantage of. Now, I mean, it's probably not the best in terms of having a list, and we are working with some of our partners to see what other capabilities we can basically implement, like with Colu, right? So they have a response to that, and we're looking to see how we can potentially implement that to enable our small businesses due to the pandemic.
So I'll just click on the next slide, and talk about kind of day-to-day operations. You mentioned that. I know you mentioned to me that different teams that weren't used to working from home, like police departments, for example, need to do their meetings now virtually. So if you can just share a few words here.
Well, actually, I think the police department was one of those departments that was pretty much prepared. I'm just trying to think in terms of human resources would be one where, it kind of hit them by surprise, and they're feeling the brunt of it. I'm just trying to think here. Jeff, Shanita, I see you on the line. If there's any other kind of, prominent use cases that you've seen out there, I'm actually relying on my staff here because they're also on the call.
Michael, you talked about permitting and inspection and those kinds of things all having to go fully virtual now, right?
Right.
No longer filling out papers and coming back to the office. You brought that up earlier. That was a big impact. Those in our water production group probably were our biggest acceptors of mobile devices once this started.
Right. And matter of fact, they actually were, I mean, they accepted it with open arms because they had been asking for it even before. It was just more of a scheduling type activity, right? What else? Shanita, from your side, is there anything that jumps out? You're on mute, Shanita, if you're not. Okay.
Michael, can we also talk, I actually just pulled the dashboard specifically for the City of Aurora from Zencity's platform to show in the last 7 days what were the key kind of concerns, issues, and feedback from your residents. So we can see the sentiment, we can see the number of interactions just for the last 7 days. And we're seeing that actually under the coronavirus project, the two most trending topics are social distancing and community organization.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you to elaborate a bit about what you're seeing from your community on these two aspects. So both on social distancing, which we see that in the last week has been 30% of the overall discussion, mostly positive and neutral sentiment, and also about the community organization.
Right. So, and this is a very interesting topic because with the social distancing, because my wife every day is on social media and she's referring to, people not following the orders of the governor and the city officials, right? And it's one of those things where, it is a big concern for people in terms of social distancing because it impacts public health. And especially when people are not complying, it creates even more dissentiment amongst our citizens. And it's just one thing that we were talking about within the City of Aurora is like getting prepared to understand the data behind, first of all, those sentiments, and also where do the problems rely, right? Many of you have probably seen some of the conversation online or the tools with regards to tracking cell data for crowds across your city, and trying to identify those hot spots where people may not be following the compliance rule, and trying to be a bit predictive, to get ahead of that, right? So if we see that, for example, in the City of Aurora, there's been an order put out that all city parks and park district parks are officially closed to the public, right? Now, at the same time, we don't have the police officers going around monitoring and enforcing that on the 24/7. Right. But when we start thinking about like smart technologies and video surveillance and having that data available when there is an issue and being notified of that in an automatic fashion, we can get ahead of the curve and those conversations within our community and online. Right. So if we have that data, we can pull insights and try to manage things more effectively.
And Michael, are you surprised that the second most talked about topic in the last week in the City of Aurora is actually community organization, which is pretty high compared to a lot of cities that we're seeing?
No, it doesn't really surprise me, because one of the areas that is kind of, prominent for me is the fact that, we're all trying to stay connected, professionally and socially, so people need that, that human interaction, because no one likes to be kind of like locked in a box and not be able to talk to anyone. So that's just a basic human need, right? So, typically you might after work, you might go for a happy hour, have a quick cocktail with your friends, talk about the day, decompress, and then go home. Now you can't do that, right? So what do, right? So you have to do that virtually if you have those different options or capabilities, right? So even maybe having a virtual happy hour, right? Different workout sessions, right? Different events where people just get together and talk about different topics, right? So it doesn't surprise me at all, right? That it's the second most talked about topic, right? because we're human and we're, human beings, and we need that socialization, right?
Yeah, and I think that also, so I'll just explain very briefly kind of what we're seeing here for people that are not already working with Zencity. What we're doing is pulling data from as many digital sources as possible: social media, local media, traditional media, and internal CRMs, and perform sentiment analysis and categorization analysis. So basically what you're seeing here, just under coronavirus discussion, just in the last 7 days, what's the sentiment, what were the sources of information it came from. You're not seeing it here, but we're on the map, we're seeing this data, and what are the different projects. So the second most talked about project here, which is almost 30% of the discussion this week, is community organizations. And Michael, Zencity and Aurora have been partners for a while now. And a year and a half ago, Aurora went through a shooting incident that kind of shook the community, and what we're able to see there and what we're able to see here now is a very resilient community that really comes together. And this is why we put off the Aurora Strong, which I think could be also relevant here. So Michael, if you just want to explain a few words about community coming together here.
Yeah, I mean, that Aurora Strong campaign has pretty much kind of, spearheaded the city's strategic direction since the Henry Pratt shooting back in February of 2019. And as you can see on most of our social media interactions, you always see Aurora Strong, right? So, being resilient and having a mayor that's very resilient, and, just his whole life kind of leading through adversity, it's very important as part of our strategy, right? And when we start talking about, leading the different employees and looking at the emotional impact of, staying at home, and basically kind of managing that risk. And I would say also the psychological aspect of that, right? And having that safe place to basically engage with people. I mean, we need to promote our employees and create that resiliency within our workforce so people can deal with the rational and irrational sides of this crisis and moving things forward. So, I mean, I think that, that resiliency is built into the DNA of the City of Aurora, and we'll just continue to basically, transcend and move forward and make the best out of adversities.
Yeah, and what we also see here is how urgent things are right now in terms of also communication between the residents and the government, and also between themselves, and kind of the need for accurate information. So I can share that Zencity is working with 140 cities today, and we see general trends. And I'll be curious, Michael, if you're seeing the same trends in your city. So we're looking at the data, and the data is changing on a day-to-day basis, even minute-by-minute basis, I would say. So we're doing weekly reports based on the information we're seeing across all cities. And what we're seeing is that 3 weeks ago, the main discussions and main concerns that residents had were around school closures. Or 2 weeks ago, social distancing became the biggest thing. And a week ago, the main discussions were actually crime. So kind of worries about crime and about what the city is going to do. Is this trend similar to what you're seeing in the City of Aurora, and what do you expect to be kind of the next thing that we see in residents' discussion?
It's a very good question. I mean, we haven't seen much issues, and as you could probably tell from the data, I mean, there hasn't been much issue around crime in the City of Aurora. Also stating that, we're one of the safest places to live within the nation, and a lot of that's contributed to the city leadership and our police department and Chief Zeman. But in terms of trends, I guess that we're anticipating, one would probably be the gathering of individuals in public places when there's a mandate for people not to, right? And we're trying to get ahead of that curve. I would also say around the public health and availability of PPE equipment and resources to help to support our public safety and first responders and our healthcare workers, right? And I know our governor is working very diligently on that topic and trying to get the resources we need through the federal lines of communication, and also his own private lines of communication. And also, I would say the other aspect that that we'll continue to see is really kind of the impact on small businesses and what's going to be available for those small business in terms of grants and loans, for those entities that have been impacted by the pandemic, because a lot of those businesses that are not essential have been forced to close. So you're talking lost wages, lost revenues, and basically bankruptcy, and businesses going out of business due to this, right? So, I know Governor Pritzker has basically instituted an Illinois Small Business Emergency Loan Fund and the Hospitality Emergency Grant Fund, so those businesses can basically apply for that through the local chambers and or online. So we have different business resources that are available for financial support. So I think those are some of the topics off the top of my head, right? I don't know, Jeff, is there anything else in there that you guys might see, or Shanita?
No, Mike, that's a great list.
None did I see.
Okay.
So so we do have a few questions that also really connect to the best practices. So someone here is asking, how is the City of Aurora dealing with misleading information and misinformation?
That's an easy one. We're using Zencity, and we're arming our councilmen, our city officials with the platform, because they have accounts, right? We just had a webinar last week with executive team members and also with councilmen and women, providing them updates and tools and tips on how to be prepared to kind of manage that misinformation, right? Because as long as you have the data, right, and you can gain the insights, they can be prepared for that conversation, right? So, we don't want to get into the conversation of the rule of three. You get the three loudest people in the city always yelling the loudest and say, we represent, the population, when in fact they don't. They only represent themselves. So having that data and being able to pull those insights easily at any given time, I think that's how we're managing, and also keeping the lines of communication, from the executive level all the way down to the staff and outwards to the community, right? Visitors, citizens, and businesses as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. And do you find that misinformation, usually the first line that needs to kind of engage back are the council members?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think here, at least within the City of Aurora, right, we basically have 10 aldermen, right, that sit on the city council. So they represent the 10 different wards. And we have 2 aldermen at large, right? And they, of course, represent the city at large. But I think those aldermen per ward are the first line of defense, right? If they have the right information or the data and they can pull that information and it's coming to them in a very consistent, regular fashion and a very concise and consumable way, right? Knowledge is power, right? And I think that's the first line of defense.
Yeah, so I think we'll open it to any other questions. So anyone that has a question that wasn't answered yet, please feel free to share. I'll ask one more question that we received. So how is the city sharing information out? So we heard about misinformation coming in, and I'm sure that the city needs to communicate in a lot of different ways right now to explain the different, what's happening in businesses, what's happening in any other sort of way. How is the city sharing the information out at this moment?
Right. So I'll give you the official answer in terms of the way we're set up, because I mentioned that we activated our virtual emergency operations center, right? So that organizational structure consists of an incident command, and also a deputy incident command. Under the incident command, we have the policy group, and we have a lead PIO, which is the public information officer, which is Clayton Muhammad, the director of media communications. Under Clayton, there is the PIO for the Aurora Police Department, and we have the PIO for the Aurora Fire Department. All information is basically funneled upwards to Clayton. It's socialized, it's aggregated, it's agreed, it's reviewed, and then that information is basically funneled out on our official channels with the city websites, the police department website, news release. We also are going to be kicking off our mayor's media brief, and that's going to be online and that's be virtual. So there's different channels in terms, or different outlets in terms, and also newspapers as well. So the important part is to make sure that we have one concise message that's going out to the public, right? And again, this is a lesson learned from when we did Henry Pratt. We had 33 state and federal agencies that swarmed in on the city of Aurora, and you had all this different information, right, that was being pushed out to the community. And I mean, it goes back to the case study that we did with Zencity, and we were able to identify, a lot of different pain points and sentiments from the community, and we were able to rectify, those lines of communication. So learning from past experience, we set this structure up, and there's different protocols in place on how we communicate and what communication goes out and by who, right? So, policy, processes, and procedures, and that helps you to force behaviors, right?
One of the cities here that hasn't been badly impacted yet, they mentioned, asking what is your advice for such cities that are in areas that haven't been as impacted or maybe didn't take the steps yet? From the CIO perspective, of course. So as a CIO of a city that wasn't as impacted yet, what will you do to get ready in different states that don't have social distancing enforced yet?
Yeah, so which city is that? Yeah, I guess that's not impacted in some type of way, because everybody's been impacted.
Less impacted than Illinois,
yeah.
I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say just open up the lines of communications with your team. Start planning and trying to anticipate based on conversations like this, and networking with your peer groups, and also working with your peers at the county and state level, and federal for that purpose, and within the private sector, right? Communication. I mean, so because only thing you can do is be prepared, right? So I mean, apart from that, you just have to react, right?
Yeah. I think maybe one last question, or maybe two last questions. So we're talking a lot about the infrastructure that is.
Sorry, no, I was going to add to that if I could, if that's all right. Sorry about that. To Mike's answer, this is Jeff again. I was just going to add that I think that we, if we were to look back, we would probably, if we could go back in time and say what do we need to do way back, was to get our supply chain of laptops rolling in here and do that due diligence around who can work from home, who should be working from home, and get that going sooner, because we played a little catch up here. Our help desk team has done yeoman's work here getting this stuff rolled out, but check your VPN infrastructure, check your licensing around that, get your hardware aligned if you need to. If you have staff who normally worked on desktops that may be in payroll or HR or something, how are you going to quickly get them to work from home? I think that was probably our longest ramp up. Wouldn't you agree, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. And I think to kind of like take that and kind of to summarize it, if we look at, okay, so if I need to be a bit more specific, what I would say is revisit your disaster recovery plans, revisit your business continuity plan, start looking at your incident response plans, start looking at your policies, right? Start reviewing, those different incident response team roles and responsibilities, right? And making sure that those things are in place, that you will be able to react in a very standard and concise manner, right? You're not going to have all the answer, but if you have those in place, you'll be able to stay within those guardrails and execute better, right?
So Michael, one last question. As we're talking a lot about all the infrastructure and all the digital kind of mobilization that we're seeing, do you think that after we're finished with COVID, all of these decisions the decision will be to still move forward with this infrastructure that is already set for virtual?
Yeah, well, actually, the interesting thing is we're trying to actually ramp up those activities right now and not wait for it to ramp, to COVID to ramp down. Because I think at least for the city of Aurora, and we're a mid-sized city, I think as long as we can show the gains that have been, how do you say, observed during this period, and people are comfortable, right? I think once they get a taste, I don't think they'll move backwards, right? So, and again, when we talk about technology delivery, the biggest challenge, at least in my experience, has always been adoption, right? Once people adopt to it and they understand it, they're not going to want to change willingly going forward, right? So that adoption point is critical, I think, right?
And do you think that, and it's another question that we got, so I'm slipping it in as the last question, do you think that Aurora is prepared right now to work virtually for an extended period of time? So if we'll need to be in this situation for months and months to come?
Well, we're actually working through that as we go now, because again, at least with our inventory, we're about 130 laptops. We don't have kind of like a virtual environment, which we need to work on, but we need to we're looking at our Office 365 environment, right? And moving that forward. So I think, although we're not at 100%, but we've passed kind of the threshold and we're working towards arriving at that point where we're more prepared, right, to work in a virtual environment, right?
City team after this to ask any questions. And Michael, again, I really appreciate your time today and the rest of the staff of Aurora, and really value your partnership. And and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining in. We appreciate it.